the next speaker is very, very important person for this meeting. And the reasons why we can sit here, we can get it together, the reasons we can host the fourth Think meeting is because of Miss Amanda. Amanda, thank you. Thank you so much. And so, Amanda, how are you doing? How are you doing, Amanda? Can you get my voice? So now your turn. I can't get your voice because of we do some work here.
I hear you very well. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yeah, I get your voice. Thank you. So today, Dr. Amanda will give us a plenary talk about the seahorse conservation in the world. I think it should be very interesting. So before her plenary talks, I want to say something about Amanda. So Amanda, is from UBC Canada. She is the fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, and she is the first person to study the seahorse and water. You may know we generally study seahorse in the lab or in a farm. If you want to do the work underwater, it's really, really difficult. So she is the first person to do this. And she also is the first person to initiate the seahorse conservation project. So somebody studied the seahorse and the sea dragon, maybe know the project Seahorse. This organization is the most important organization in the world. So she made it. And of course, she has already got lots of awards because of her outstanding work. But today, I do want to particularly mention the one prize. In the last year, she became the first marine conservation to win the world's leading animal conservation prize, Indian Nepalese Prize. In China, we call this prize is the Marine Nobel Prize. So it's very, very important. And she is one of the 6 global members for the prize for animal conservation in 2010 and 2016. So it's very, very important. You really give us lots of surprise, Amanda. I just know you became the fellow of the Royal Society last year. I first noticed a few days ago, a couple of competitions. So, okay, time to you. Now let's warmly welcome Dr. Amanda to give us this talk. Let's welcome. Thank you, Amanda.
Thank you very much. Well, given the uncertainties of Zoom across very large distances, I've actually recorded the talk. I wanted to let you know that I am thrilled to be here, absolutely delighted, and I'm looking forward to coming again to Guangzhou as soon as possible. And in the meantime, perhaps I'll let you play the recorded lecture talk, and then we can have some questions if people have energy at the end. So let me thank Chang Nin and the entire team at the South China Seas Institute of Oceanography for their magnificent efforts, as John said, over many, many years of sorting this out. And I was so disappointed last year when COVID meant we had to suspend this meeting, and so excited that it's actually running this year, albeit in a different form. So congratulations to the whole wonderful team in Guangzhou. And yes, thanks indeed to Lily Stanton for working so closely with you. We're so excited. So let's go. I think we're not getting any sound and the lecture's already playing. We're not getting any sound at all, John. Chang Nin, no sound.
Hello, Amanda. Hello. So sorry, Amanda.
Hi.
Yeah, I think it's a little break about your presentation. So please give me 1 minute. We want to listen to your presentation again. Sorry for that. Okay. Okay. Yeah, because Amanda's presentation is a video before the meeting, so now we just follow the video here. So at the beginning, maybe different delay.
Array of disciplines that affect the well-being of our cygnathid population. I'm so glad to be here with you. I'm delighted to be speaking to colleagues in China and around the world about global action for seahorse conservation. I want to first start by thanking the South China Seas Institute of Oceanography, China's Academy of Science, for its fantastic efforts in hosting this meeting while we still struggle with our global pandemic. And really wish I could be there in Guangzhou, but at least we get to connect this way. So I'm going to give a very broad general talk about the context for seahorse conservation around the world. And in so doing, I'll embrace most of the countries of the world, but also a whole array of disciplines that affect the well-being of our cygnathid populations. I'm going to focus on seahorses, but much of what I say is relevant to pipefishes particularly, and to some extent to sea dragons. So let me take you to the world of seahorses. There are about 46 species globally distributed. And they are found, as you'll see by the blue markings, in most of the shallow, temperate, and tropical seas. Particular concentrations of species in East and Southeast Asia, where the meeting is physically located, while we all come in from around the world virtually. So the seahorses are still growing in number, mostly for pygmy species that are being added. But generally, it'll be in the 40s for a while at least. They are heavily threatened, first and foremost, by fisheries. So most species that are under pressure, the extraction is the biggest problem. Some of this is by small-scale selective fishing. Some of it is done by individuals who go out at night, go out during the day, and work extremely hard to extract very few animals. Some of it's done by developed country aquarium collectors. But the biggest pressure comes from non-selective fisheries, from gears like seine nets or bottom trawling, particularly bottom trawling. Bottom trawling is when you drop a heavily weighted net across the ocean floor and drag it, removing everything in the path, including seahorses and pipefishes, and of course, all the habitats on which they live and all the communities of animals with which they engage. It is a very, very damaging form of fishing. It is also a nightmare for the cygnathid populations of the world. More on that in a bit. So you have fishing as the major pressure on cygnathid's, but in many areas for particular species, the biggest struggle comes from habitat loss. And of course, habitat degradation and damage affects all cygnathid's one way or another. So our fishes are found in seagrasses, mangroves, coral reefs, estuaries, macroalgae or seaweeds, as well as in open water. And of course, these are some of the most critical and some of the most threatened marine habitats in the world. So we do need to pay attention to that. And particularly when it comes to the most threatened seahorse species. So Hippocampus capensis is from South Africa, found in only 3 estuaries. And those estuaries are subject to a lot of eutrophication and other habitat damage. That is the major pressure on that species. Hippocampus whiteye is another endangered species, this one from Eastern Australia. And it too is subject to habitat damage first and foremost, although other pressures as well. But then when we get to the vulnerable species, so these are the next most threatened species, we find 12 species, and most of them threatened primarily by indiscriminate non-selective fishing. And then we have 1 species near threatened, 10 species we're happy about, and about 17 species that are data deficient, meaning we don't even know enough to assess how they're doing. They could be in terrible trouble or they could be faring very well. We need much more data and much more understanding of these species in order to make sure that their populations are secure. And then 4 species, primarily pygmy seahorses, are not yet evaluated. For those of you interested in the pipefishes, we also have a tremendous number that are data deficient or not yet evaluated, about 1/3 of the pipefishes. as well as having some that are distributed across the threat categories. For the pipe horses, they are all either least concern or more worryingly data deficient. The sea dragons is the same. If we look at where they're located, we see vulnerable species all over the world, but we particularly see them in East and Southeast Asia, of course, commensurate with the fact there are more species in the region. 3 out of the 4 species in the Americas are also vulnerable. And then we have, of course, a very endangered species, the one I mentioned down in South Africa. So in response to all of this, we've established Project Seahorse, and I direct Project Seahorse, which is an alliance between the University of British Columbia and the Zoological Society of London. We are explicit in our mission to conserve seahorses through sustainable use, but also by saving seahorses to save the seas. And we do this with a marriage of research and management. So we study the seahorses, we study the issues affecting the seahorses, and we use our findings to inform policy and management. And then, of course, the policy and management imperatives drive the research that we do in a very tight feedback loop. And we're very directed at deploying all possible tools to achieve conservation success. So we regard the world as a bit of an onion. We regard the world as having multiple layers of pressure bearing down on the cygnathrids in the center of our world. So here's the seahorses, pipefishes, sea dragons. And we do a lot of research on their biology, but of course, studying the animals won't safeguard them. You've also got to look after their communities, their habitats, their ecosystems. And there too we work. And then of course, these ecosystems are coming under enormous pressure, as I mentioned, from fisheries. So you need to pay attention to fisheries. Fishers make decisions based on the well-being of their families and their communities. So we need to be very conscious of whether kids are in school, whether there is a roof over their heads, whether fishers are free to make good decisions, whether they are working as slaves on bottom trawlers, which is often the case. Beyond that, we need to pay attention to the region. Is it possible to make a living? Are there economic opportunities? Is there law and order? Is there good governance? And that would be true at the national level as well, where legislation, law, policy really sets the scene for a lot of what happens right down to the seahorses of the country, as well as, of course, the people who interact with them. Ultimately, you reach the global scale, where United Nations and other multilateral environmental agreements actually create the context for national action or not. And the outer layer of this onion world, if you like, you'll have human behaviors of greed and altruism, self-discipline and self-indulgence. And there we need to work as well. So Project Seahorse is active in all these spheres. And of course, all these spheres cover the talks that are going to be given at this SingBio meeting. So Project Seahorse has done a lot in the context of biological research. We have done genetic work and taxonomic work and phylogenetic work and behavioral ecology and ecology. And that set a lot of the underpinnings for our conservation management and policy work. And I'm still surprised that I was the first biologist to work on seahorses underwater, and so excited by how many people, all of you, now work on these splendid seahorses, as well as, of course, the pipefishes and the sea dragons. Beyond the biological research, of course, we're very committed to understanding ecosystems and to taking action for their well-being. So as an example of this, and we do a lot of work in this sphere, as an example of this, we set up an array of protected areas in the Philippines. So it was Filipino members of the team, biologists and social workers working together in a community-based approach. And the first community to set up a marine protected area, or an MPA, was in Handumon in the Philippines, in this area. That was set up initially to protect seahorses, but rapidly became an MPA to protect all marine life. And we have seen a tremendous resurgence of marine life in the region, really measurable gains in the number of species and the density of species and the diversity of species in the region. And that MPA was so successful and engaged so many people that lots of other villages wanted to set up their own MPAs. So we've now generated, fostered, supported the creation of 35 marine protected areas, all of them either no take, no exploitation, or very managed in zones. So this is a place where you very rapidly got buy-in to a new approach that worked extremely well. However, as we mentioned, habitat damage is one of the problems, and MPAs respond to that, but also fisheries are a major concern. So we have done rather a lot with fisheries, but I'm going to skip over that and go to trade at the moment and come back to fisheries. So trade, I did the first tracking of the seahorse trade, which also involves pipe fishes and pipe horses. And it was startling to discover how massive it was, with probably about 80 nations trading tens of millions of seahorses every year. From that work, we were asked to, and that trade appeared to be the major pressure bearing down on seahorses. So we were asked to engage with global action by CITES, which is the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, which involves now 182 different countries. And CITES regulates exports of marine fishes that are or may become threatened by poorly managed exploitation and export. So at that point, CITES refused to engage with any marine fishes, regarding them as economic commodities of too much value to be brought under that convention. Through our work, we're very excited that we gained the first ever global export controls on marine fishes with seahorses breaking through that barrier. And it was not an easy task, but we had much engagement and support. The seahorses actually set precedent for this. So after the seahorses and their exports had been regulated, colleagues and with our support were also able to arrange for the export regulations on species like white shark and, basking shark and whale shark, and Napoleon wrasse or humphead wrasse and the white shark, and the European eels and the sawfishes, and so it went. So we now set precedent with seahorses to have global export controls on quite an array of different fish species. Now, Project Seahorse clearly doesn't do this work alone. So we're very proud to be leading on a major global export network. The IUCN is a global alliance of all conservation organizations, really, well, 1,450 of them, primarily non-governmental organizations, but also about 225 government agencies, government departments, government authorities are members of the IUCN Alliance, along with 100 indigenous organizations. And within this IUCN union, you have a series of expert groups for particular taxa, particular, species, or it can be a family or a whole array of different taxa. And Project Seahorse leads on the global expert group for 1,450 organizations. So we have involved members from all around the world, as you see from the yellow stars, people who know what they're doing when it comes to seahorses, pipefishes, and sea dragons. We now have 37 experts from 19 countries, including, I'm really proud to say, 2 from China, our host, John Lin, and also Xiangyang, who will speak to you later today. And these members get together most recently last week to talk about what can be done for signathid conservation, bringing their expertise to bear in a purely voluntary capacity. They are not paid at all for this work. So 19 countries so far, and we're still looking for experts from around the world. And this specialist group, this expert group, works together on a number of initiatives. So one thing is I'm going to tell you more about is within this global alliance, the IUCN, we've written a resolution to take global action for signathid fishes. More on that soon. We've also convinced CITES, that global alliance of 182 countries that regulates international trade, to look more carefully at how well those export controls are being implemented. We work on assessing the conservation status of signathids at the global level, and that's the list I gave you. That was the work we did as a specialist group to figure out global conservation status. We're now also assessing the national status of signathids, and you'll hear more about that, Lily, from Lily Stanton. We've described 3 new species of seahorse, and you'll hear more about that. We're also probing the potential for captive breeding only for the most threatened species, only as an emergency safety net, only with 1,000 precautions, because captive breeding can go badly wrong for wild populations. The specialist group also works in countries around the world, with just these as some examples. We have managed to get, as I mentioned, hippocampus white-eye listed as endangered globally under the IUCN Red List, but also nationally. And with national listing comes full protection for the populations and their habitats. As we mentioned, conservation largely is the purview of national governments. We've also in Australia engaged in habitat enhancement for this species. In Brazil, we've been involved in measures to end illegal capture and trade of seahorses, and also in setting up and enforcing protected areas. In China, members of the specialist group have founded an NGO for seahorses, established community science monitoring, and helped protect seahorse habitats. In Portugal, we're involved right now in the creation of 2 new protected areas. And members of our specialist group are also leading the way in trying to tackle illegal fishing in lagoon systems in southern Portugal. In South Africa, members of the specialist group have developed a recovery plan for the critically endangered Signathus watermayeri pipefish, which is the most threatened cygnathid in the world, and have really got on top of understanding its biology and ecology this year and developing an action plan. So we do a lot of work as a collective expert group to assess, plan, and act, most of all act to protect cygnathids by networking and communicating. So if you want to know more, let me know. So through this work, I mentioned we've developed global action with the IUCN. I told you about the IUCN from 170 countries, and they have recently just agreed to take action to conserve these animals. So the IUCN Specialist Group on Seahorse, Pipefish, and Sea Dragons wrote this global action statement that became a resolution last November. So this now commits these 1,450 organizations to take action. And this was some of the background information that was provided, so that we recognized that there were vast illegal exports of dried seahorses. We recognized that we needed to do something about these non-selective fishing gears. We're worried about aquaculture ventures that don't think through what they're doing and add pressure to wild populations. We wanted to make certain that releases from captive populations were really carefully constrained and managed, because unthinking releases can do so much damage as well, and so on. And based on this background information, we prepared action points for IUCN. And the first of them is to recognize that the specialist group that I've been describing can provide support for all sorts of agencies, organizations, and governments. And the second is to recognize that these species that we all love and cherish so much are really iconic. They're really valuable. They can marshal a huge amount of collective effort by engaging people in their charisma, by using them to tell stories. And with all this background information, we got the following agreement. So all of these organizations, including 225 government agencies around the world, have agreed that all cygnathids need to be assessed at the national or regional level. So every country represented by us as biologists, scientists, technical people working on cygnathids, all those countries should have national assessments of the national status, because national and international assessments are not the same. You could have a global assessment that says the species are thoroughly threatened, but a local assessment that says in our particular country, we're okay, or the other way around. Globally, they're okay, but in our particular country, we have trouble. So we need to do national assessments. We also need to keep those global assessments up to date. And we need to make certain that when we're fighting illegal wildlife trade, we include cygnathids in our consideration of wildlife. More on that in a minute. We also need to really apply sound technical guidance to any reintroductions, releases, or translocations. Very important. And finally, we need to make very certain that governments commit to protecting and restoring the habitats where cygnathids live. Now, I want to make sure you realize that all of these are agreed actions now at a global level. So now we just need to hold people accountable to. So state and government members are required through this resolution to enforce regulations on a whole host of different parameters in ocean conservation that affect cygnathids. Like, let's enforce the good regulations we have, not just keep them on paper. We're reminding governments to meet their CITES obligations, the trade export regulations. Wait a minute for more on that. We've got to make certain we take the pressure off with better control of these non-selective fisheries. We've got to make certain that governments meet their obligations to increase their MPA coverage to 30% of the ocean by 2030 for each country. And we'd like to remove subsidies that actually pay fishers to extract too much. And finally, there's a desperate need to restrict aquaculture, only doing aquaculture where risk analysis shows that it's safe for wild populations. So these are the commitments made by government and all of these member organizations. And we'll be working as a specialist group, an expert group, and with Project Seahorse to put enormous pressure on governments to follow up with these commitments, to encourage them and guide them to meeting these commitments. Now, the other big global initiative right now is with CITES. CITES, as I mentioned, is the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, with the which is a UN organization with 182 countries that are signed up and committed to this. And they deal with species that are or may become threatened by international trade. There are 3 requirements. First of all, we need to make sure that exports of seahorses do not damage wild populations. A country is only allowed to export seahorses if the government confirms that that export is not detrimental, is not a problem for wild populations. They also have to be legally obtained, so not from protected areas or not in illegal fishing gear, and any live animals have to be treated well in shipment. Now, CITES has a mechanism called a review of significant trade that encourages countries to comply with these responsibilities, and if they don't, it can set recommendations and sanctions in place. And recently, CITES has actually addressed these recommendations to a number of countries. The consequence is that countries have been closing down exports because they could not meet their obligations. They were not doing a good job of restricting trade to sustainable levels. So this is what the global export pie looked like of seahorses before the CITES implementation was really urgently required of countries. And you'll see that Thailand was the biggest single exporter by an awful lot. But this was the entire array of sourcing for seahorses, particularly in the exports of dried animals for traditional Chinese medicine and for souvenirs and curiosities. And gradually over the review of significant trade, countries being closing their exports because they couldn't meet their obligations. So that now only 3% of what was previously the global exports should be in trade legally. Now, we don't particularly want all these trades to end. We would prefer sustainable export. We would prefer sustainable management. We would prefer properly managed export trade. But at the moment, this is the situation while countries struggle to meet their responsibilities. So only 3% of former trade should be actually out there, according to the country's own rules. And indeed, the recorded trade has declined hugely. So this is the number of individual seahorses. At some point, it was about 8 million in records. I mean, it's much greater than that if you look at the undocumented trade. But in the recorded trade, it was about 8 million animals with a bit of a dip and a blurb. But then this is when the process for encouraging countries to get serious about their implementation kicked in. This is when countries had to be accountable for whether they were meeting their obligations. And as you see, the recorded trade plummeted as countries realized that they weren't doing their job and they just closed the trade. So there should be this tiny little trade. But we have done research in Hong Kong recently that shows that there is still a massive trade, first of all, going on, but also that in all of the trade going through Hong Kong, which is the largest trade center for dried seahorses in the world, 95% of all the imported seahorses in Hong Kong, many of them destined for shipment onwards to mainland China or Taiwan, Singapore, so on, that 95% had come from countries that claimed that they had closed down the seahorse trade, that they had eliminated seahorse exports for the moment. So 95% of all of the trade going through Hong Kong was therefore illegal because those countries had declared that they were not exporting. So realizing that, we've worked with CITES now as an IUCN specialist group, expert group, to lead CITES to make new decisions to better manage the trade of seahorses. the parties are now committed to reporting on management measures for seahorses and their implementation. The parties are now committed to telling their seahorse traders about quotas and trade suspensions. I mean, it really is vital that traders know about these if they're going to comply, and also to develop monitoring programs. And CITES, the Secretariat, the central office in Switzerland, is now asked to really get serious about investigating and analyzing the live trade, which may be just as full of illegal trade, the trade in live seahorses, and also to holding an expert workshop to try to figure this all out and discover how we're going to get rid of this illegal trade and manage legal trade properly. And so our Project Seahorse team has been asked to take on several of these tasks, and we're just about to complete a report on the management measures for seahorses in 10 key countries around the world, and what those countries are doing to meet their obligations and how things might be improved. And we're also this week finishing writing an investigation, a huge investigation of the live trade of seahorses, which we will release as a report very, very soon, the next few weeks. So we're starting to work on this, and the workshop is the next step, but CITES is taking its responsibility seriously, and we're proud to be helping to lead on this. But all of this focuses on trade. It focuses on trade as the major threat to seahorses. But in fact, if you close down trade, but the non-selective fisheries are still ongoing, then you've really not achieved very much. Those seahorses, those pipe fishes are still being hauled out of the ocean. Those pipe horses are still being extracted. So it's no use putting trade regulations in place without also looking at the sourcing of the animals. And the sourcing of the animals, as we've said, is primarily with bottom trawling, also with other forms of non-selective gear, but bottom trawling is the single biggest issue. And this issue is much bigger than seahorses. Bottom trawling is a serious problem for the world's oceans, such that we feel that there's got to be a move to wind down, constrain, and eventually end bottom trawling. And this is something that is policy already in some countries and is already constrained in many other countries. So China and the Philippines and Indonesia and Thailand and so on all have restrictions on bottom trawling, but these need to be much better enforced and much more seriously taken to a global scale. So I want to show you this 1-minute video to explain why bottom trawling is such a massive concern.
It is appalling how bottom trawl fishing is destroying our seas. All over the world, bottom trawlers are clear-cutting our ocean floor and dragging up most marine life along the way. Boats drop wide-mouthed nets with heavy weights that gouge and scrape, mowing down seagrasses and corals. These nets catch thousands of species, from seahorses to sharks, including many juvenile fish that should grow into valuable human food. The waste of life is atrocious, and the cost is dreadful. Landed catch is now often sold unsorted for mere pennies as feed for farmed fish or other animals. Bottom trawling is unprofitable and only continues because our governments give them our money to keep them fishing. It gets worse. Some trawlers even rely on crews of slaves or other forced labor. Bottom trawling is annihilation fishing. It needs to stop. It is appalling how bottom trawl fishing.
I really do want to emphasize that annihilation fishing is what we're dealing with. Bottom trawling now commonly goes out with no target species in mind, just extracting whatever the trawlers can find, and is then sold primarily for chicken feed, animal feed, aquaculture feed, often by being reduced to fish meal or sold as fish oil. Bottom trawling has to be constrained. There is no end point to this annihilation fishing. To tell you how bad it is, most bottom trawlers only catch 1 to 2 seahorses per vessel per night, 1 or 2 seahorses per boat per night. So it looks like a nothing. And then countries with big bottom trawling capacity are exporting something in the neighborhood of 5 million seahorses a year. You do the maths on how serious bottom trawling is for our ocean floor. So I hope that I've provided with you with a sense of what the global issues are and where we need to go with them. But I want to emphasize that the only way that seahorse conservation, ocean conservation is going to progress is if we take note of these multi-layered approaches that must be integrated for us to be effective.
Therefore, all forms of biological research, research on protected areas, research on area-based management, research on fisheries constraints, research on aquaculture and captive breeding, research on people's interactions with the environment. Any form of knowledge generation that we can do, if brought to bear, can help make a difference to the future for these animals. And whatever your own domain, your own discipline, your own interest, I think we all have to agree that we think these animals are absolutely splendid, and we've got to keep them in the oceans for forever, for the entire future. And remember that if we succeed in saving seahorses, we will have also done a large part to save the seas. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. Thank you so much. I think your plenary talk is really give us very interesting, exciting, and instructive information for us. So I really get a lot from your talk, especially the Army War and also the NGO in China and the protect area and lots of rules in the world. So because of the time limitation, I think we only have 2 questions. So if any, just raise your hand, please. Any question? Okay, and then I have a question. So things you know, the trade, the export is very, very important for the seahorse conservation. So in China, we generally say no eat, no trade. So then what about, do you think, you know, it's really difficult to control the seahorse eating in China. So what about the trade if we still eat them? And, you know, China has the biggest market for conservation, especially the Chinese traditional medicine. So if we still eat the seahorse, then what we'll do in the next step, especially for the trade?
Thank you. You were a little difficult, the sound wasn't great. So can I ensure that I understood the question? You're commenting that China is a major market for seahorses, where China is very valued in traditional, seahorses are very valued in traditional Chinese medicine. And you're asking me what steps we could take to ensure that this does not threaten wild populations. Is that correct?
Yes, yeah, right. Because also you know, the agriculture in China is very popular of seahorse. So then I want to balance the status of the agriculture and the seahorse conservation. I want to know the balance.
Thank you. Yes. So aquaculture can be helpful if it follows the protocols put out by the IUCN well, aquaculture can be helpful, but often what aquaculture does is try to create new markets for the commodity. And we don't want to create new markets. We want to try to make sure that the use is sustainable. I should start by saying that my daughter was actually born in China, and I have a very deep, deep affection for China. And I value traditional Chinese medicine a great deal and use it myself at times. So I'm completely comfortable with the idea that seahorses can be used. They can be used for health products or for ornamental display, or even for curios. But the importance is not to deplete wild populations to unsustainable levels. And I think that aquaculture has a place in that, but it's incredibly important that it follow protocols so that it does not release animals to the wild. Releasing animals to the wild, if you don't do it carefully, is very problematic. There are global protocols now for releasing animals to the wild of any species. And we're about to produce those protocols from the specialist group. We would very much like to have everybody who works in aquaculture make certain they do risk analyses and make certain that they follow protocols and try to avoid releasing them to the wild where they can damage wild populations. But I know that it is a big interest in China, and I'm very happy to explore that more with colleagues.
Okay, got it. Thank you.